think there's a whole host of things about Carl Riddle. I always called him Mr. Riddle. I never called him Carl, just out of respect. But the things I always felt about Mr. Riddle were, when you speak of him, I think you have to speak of a couple of things. First of all, he and his wife, because they were such a great team, and she was a teacher also. In fact, had my son in some summer Spanish classes, and just what a fantastic woman Mrs. Riddle is today. When you speak of him, you speak of his family and his daughter. His daughter's a classroom teacher, and his granddaughters are teachers. So I think, as you look at the DNA in Carl Riddle, you can see some chalk dust there because of just the quality of person and role model he was for his family. As a school leader, he was just second to none. He carried himself with such class and dignity. He was always dressed appropriately. I've often had people like Craig McKee say to me, he said, Danny, you're one of the best dressed people ever in the school system, but you'll always be number 2 to Carl Riddle, because he always had that professional look about him. And he was one never to raise his voice, raise his tone, to get out of control, but he always handled the situation with care and with the right touch. And I think that was a sign of a good administrator, that you don't have to always be loud and always have to raise your voice, but sometimes you just do it by taking care of business by who you are. And some of the things that I've heard about Mr. Riddle over time, and some great stories, are the one time there was a fight in the hallway, and when they knew Mr. Riddle was coming, the fight stopped immediately. Well, he walked into the middle of the fight, and as he stopped, and no one would admit who was fighting, he had every student stop, and he went around and touched their hearts. And he said, touched the heart of 2 kids whose hearts were beating faster than anyone else. Said, you 2 were fighting, weren't you? And they were the ones. So that's just, he didn't go in and scream and yell. He just did it with a certain way. Story of a student chewing tobacco one time in an assembly, and he knew the kid was chewing tobacco, so what he did was he just brought the kid down next to him and engaged him in conversation while that kid had to, I'm sure, swallow a little bit of tobacco juice, just to teach that kid a lesson that you're not that sneaky. Or this morning, hearing Matt Branham speak, who was a graduate of Terre Haute North, and Matt, at the time, his family was living in a trailer, and Matt was at school one day, and Mr. Riddle said, hey, Matt, you want to go have lunch? And Matt said yes, and Mr. Riddle took him to Kiwanis. And in Kiwanis, he saw all these men dressed up in ties and suits and role models, and it was the first time he had felt inspiration into wanting to give more and do more. Anthony and Ernie Thompson, poor African-American kids from the inner city, who he took under his wings and called them in all the time and talked with them and helped them and guided them. And those are the stories that you hear about Carl Riddle, just the consummate professional, if you will. I think when you think of greatness in education, his name comes to mind quickly. And then finally, they had a recent celebration of the principals of Terre Haute North, and they were all introduced one after another, and they all received a round of applause. But at the same time, when Mr. Riddle's name was mentioned, the whole room stood and gave a standing ovation. And that's the kind of command that he had in the job that he did for kids. And the traditions at North today and many in the school system are directly tied to what he started in 1971-72. I think his footprint and fingerprints are all over the building, and I think when things happen and they talk about the Queen's dinner and they talk about the graduation ceremony, how those traditions started, they'll talk about that and reference that back to Mr. Riddle, the different academic awards and honors, the way they conduct different events. It's always done with class and decorum, and that's the kind of man he was, a military man who brought that presence into the building. So I think that although people won't know him as an individual, they'll know him through the traditions that he started. Mr. North Vigo High School, it means Mr. North, Mr. Patriot. When you talk about North Vigo, you can't say North High School without saying Mr. North Patriot, Carl Riddle.